Martin, you're home now, right? So
Yes.
this is home for you. You
Yes.
grew up here. You have some of your former classmates and colleagues in the audience with
Yeah.
you. I'm sure you've done this spiel about the book countless times and you can do it in your sleep. But let's take advantage of the fact that you're in your home court, right? This
Sure.
is where you grew up. This
Yeah.
is you're spending a few weeks with us in the Philippines. Maybe tell us about your journey in your own words.
Yeah.
What brought you to this point, generally.
Okay. Thank you. And by the way, like I've followed a lot of your work, Paulo, and I think the Philippine ecosystem is in a moment where there's a lot more optimism and hope for what's to come. So I'm so happy to be here. So the story begins when I joined Google about 10 years ago, and Google allows employees to have what they call 20% projects. So these are passion projects that are connected somehow to the business, but not exactly connected to your own role. And then this is where I meet Josh Yellen. So Josh, who's my co-author, they're building Google's first accelerator program for founders, and many of them were outside of Silicon Valley. The thesis was, talent is distributed equally around the world, but let's give access to mentorship, to some extent funding. And I told him, okay, let me dig into the research and see if I could be useful, because my line of work was really around leadership and org development. I was doing a lot of that for our engineering teams at Google. And I found this classic study out of Harvard that surveyed VCs to ask them, think of the companies in your portfolio that recently failed. What were the top reasons for failure? And Ron mentioned this earlier, that the study found that 65% of startups failed because of people issues. And that's failing to bring on the right people, failing to create a really good positive team dynamic. A lot of it is co-founder conflict. So we thought, okay, I asked Josh for a very small budget. Let's do a very simple, no-frills leadership workshop. Let's take what we know works with Google leaders, and let's create something for founders. So we bring this program to Jakarta, and it's offered across all for those of you who aren't familiar with an accelerator program, usually have topics around basically everything. So you have machine learning, design. Back then, machine learning was like the hottest topic. Design, marketing, etc. So we run this 2-day workshop, and it gets rated the most useful, the most valuable part of the accelerator experience. So we thought, okay, there's an anomaly here, let's try it again. So we bring it to Bangalore, and again, it gets rated like the highest. And at some point, we bring it to I think the third location was in, I think we brought it to Singapore at some point, we brought it to Sao Paulo, we brought it to Warsaw. Before the pandemic, the last location was in Stockholm. And so at some point, it had reached founders in about 70 countries. And as I remember the first time that we brought it to South Africa in Johannesburg, one of the founders said, look, you've now run this across the world. Like, where's the book that captures all that you've learned? So there wasn't a book. So we thought, okay, maybe we should take seriously this idea of writing a book. And I think when I reflect on why that very simple workshop really meant a lot to these founders, and many of them would turn around and run the workshop for their own circle of founder friends, is I think there's a misconception in the startup ecosystem that sounds something like this, that failure of startups is usually around market timing, it's usually about running out of cash or not having the right product. When actually we see that a lot of the most promising startups that have all of that will fail anyway because of the people issues. So what we do in the book is we, to Paulo's point around the rigor, the challenge in the startup ecosystem is there are a lot of successful startup founders that come up on stage and talk about, here are the 10 lessons I've learned in running a startup, or here are the 5 lessons I've learned. And when you look at them side by side, at some point they don't exactly line up perfectly. And what you are observing there is what psychologists would call survivor bias, right? Which is, when you look at 2 people who actually succeeded and you ask them why they succeed, before you follow their advice, you should check if the people who failed did exactly the same and failed anyway, right? And so so what we do with the book is we actually, with all the data we've collected with founders across the world, we're actually able to look at, put under a microscope the best and the worst in our data set, and to understand, well, what exactly is the difference between these 2 groups of founders? And so what we do in the book is we try to lay out what we've seen as patterns of failure points, if you will, traps, as we call it in the book, that that really sinks a lot of the most promising startups.
Yeah, very exciting, Martin. I think how we think about it on the Kaya side is a startup is nothing but a collection of talent, right?
Yeah.
I think what we say is the startup game and business is a team sport, right? Uh, there are very handful of companies that might be able to succeed with that not being true, but 99.99% of startups are a collection of founders coming together,
Yeah.
believing in a common spirit. Perhaps let's start with the title, Martin, right?
Yeah.
Because you came to and I've heard you talk about how you came to arrived at the title of the book. You mentioned the workshops that you ran for the Google Founders Project all over the world as being kind of one of the proof points of how you knew that this kind of methodology that you came up with is applicable not only in the US, but indeed across cultures. Tell us, why did you call it the bonfire
Yeah.
moment? And for those who haven't read the book, maybe give us an
Yeah.
perspective
So
there.
I wanted to call it Teams Are Harder Than Tech, was actually officially what I wanted to call it. But over time, my publisher was like, look, you need something that's more emotive. And also, we call it the bonfire moment because of the realization that, when you think of the experience of a founder, for those of you who are founders in the room, you'll probably relate to this. Oftentimes, it feels like you're constantly in the fire. Like there's this intensity, this pressure cooker kind of experience where it's like you're running around with your hair on fire. And so the bonfire moment we've distilled it down to a one-day workshop, and we've open sourced it through the book. And it's a day where you can step out of that fire and observe the fire together as a team. You might bandage up relational wounds, you kind of get back in touch with the mission, and you prepare for that next push. And so that was the idea behind the bonfire moment, where it's a moment where we ask startup teams to just spend one day as early in the journey as possible, and pick up the tools in this book where you really get to some real talk about some of the people issues that have sunk many of the startups, and to the extent that you can avoid and prevent them. This workshop helps them with that.
Yeah. Great. So walk us through, right? So I think everyone is here to really hear about the conclusions you've come to in writing the book. You've run this workshop across multiple teams, across cultures around the world.
Yeah.
Walk us through what, practically speaking, like for the founders in the room, what is this bonfire moment workshop all about? What are the questions that you're bringing to the fore?
Yeah.
Just process-wise.
Yeah. So let me tell you, the reason why I didn't like the title Bonfire Moment is because this day that we put founders through is actually not a very cozy and comfortable. So we were clear to not call it a campfire moment, because that would be like s'mores and blankets if you were in America. So it's a pretty intense day of fairly uncomfortable conversation. So it starts off where we ask founders and founding teams, so this is not just for the founding team, but also for their early team, to first self-reflect. And we have them look through. So in our analysis of the world of founders that are in our data set, we've actually come up with 7 strategies that we've seen the most effective founders employ. And these are things like, to what extent are you protecting your team from distractions, or to what extent are you thoughtful about how much you micromanage? How much do you make sure that there's equality? There's a sense of equality in the. So it's this list of 7 strategies that we ask people to self-reflect on. And for those who want to go a step further, we also allow them to do a 360-degree feedback survey where you invite your teammates, your co-founders, your board to provide feedback. And then it becomes a moment where you can kind of look at how far you are from what we think is the paragon of what strong leadership looks like in these environments. And then we guide people through this process of really articulating some of the unspoken kind of conditions you have as you come in. We find that, a few things happen in this part of the workshop where we find that founders usually come in with very specific motivations that oftentimes are left unspoken. So we talk about in the book this idea of the head, heart, and the wallet. So founders usually have a motivation around the head, which is, I know of this really difficult problem and I want to solve it with, elegant tech. Others will come with with heart as their motivation, which is I care deeply about a user group and I want to make a difference in their lives, or in a country or whatnot. And then there's the wallet, which is, yes, it's financial gain, but it's also kind of a non-financial or a social wallet, which is I like this because I like the title of CEO, or I get to shake hands with people in different circles. And many times we leave that unspoken. And so it's a moment where we can get people to be very explicit around, am I here because of head, heart, or wallet? And we find that when founders have a mismatch in motivation, it's not necessarily the end of the world, but you need to make sure you're aligned about how things are different, because the moment an investor comes or someone wants to buy out your company, you'll make very different choices, which will then lead to the kind of conflict that will create these startup breakups. So you want to get aligned on that. We also spend time in this workshop, in that section of the workshop, really talking about, how do I like to give feedback? How do I like to resolve conflict? What are the ways in which I will feel that this partnership is unfair? Part of the reason, I'll back up real quick, part of the reason why that's such a valuable part of the workshop is we find that a lot of startups, especially first-time founders, will tend to start their companies with friends or family. This is like majority of startups. It's either college buddy or a spouse, God forbid, like that. And the problem with this is we know from the data, and I know some of you who have startups probably have this set up in your company. What the data shows is that friends and family, if you start up with that is the most unstable partnership. More stable than that, I know people are like nervously laughing, like, oh my God, what have I done? More stable than that would be people who are acquaintances, people who kind of find each other through an interview style type process. And then most stable would be people who are former colleagues, because then you see them in a professional setting, you understand their skills, you know their networks. So we find that because the reason why that's so unstable is because it's an expensive relationship, right? The value of that relationship is not just professional, but it's also personal. And so the likelihood that they will have those tough conversations is much less.
Yeah, I'll interrupt you there, Martin, because I think counterintuitive, right? And how Philippine startups are born, Philippine businesses are born. You work with your family, right? Family business is the main mode of what drives the economy forward. So you're saying one of your findings in your empirical research working across the Google network of startups is that that's the least type of stable relationship.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Perhaps maybe unpack that a bit more for everyone.
So the message is not therefore to quit because you're bound to. So what we want to say is that it just means if this is your configuration as a founding team, like you need to work doubly hard on making sure you create the conditions where you're having those tough conversations. And in some ways, the bonfire moment is like a container for all those tough conversations to be had.
Right. If I can play back to you, Martin, kind of how I understood the moment, and for everyone who hasn't been able to read the book yet, the bonfire moment is those difficult conversations that are often left unsaid.
Yeah.
And I think in a culture such as ours, and less so in the Philippines, but less so in the US, but in the Philippines, we're painfully indirect, right?
Yes.
Is the way I describe our culture, right? We'd rather not say anything than, ruffle the feathers of your loved one who's helping you with the business along the way, right? So if, again, just to, I think, paraphrase the nature of the workshop as you've constructed it, it's this bull session, right? It's this
that's one way. Yeah. It's one way that I've described it in the past. It's like marriage counseling without the sex. So I don't know if I can say that here, but it's very much like that. And so the favorite part of mine in the workshop is what we call the bullshit circle.
Yeah.
And the bullshit circle is kind of that moment in the day, usually in the afternoon, where we invite people to reflect on a big challenge. One big trap, and we spend a whole chapter on this in the book, is called the trap of confidence, which is we first of all, founders are inherently overconfident people. Like, you have to be overconfident to even get started, right? If you knew exactly what it would take to build what you were building, and I look at all the founders here, like, if you knew exactly what it would take to build, you wouldn't get started. So somehow you need to be overconfident. Now, that becomes almost exclusively a liability beyond that early stage, because then people who are overconfident will not seek out help. They will underprepare, and we know this from the data. There's data, that has studied overconfident CEOs, and they will overpay for acquisitions, and that will result in a drop in their stock price. So we know that overconfidence is a tricky, is fire for these environments. And so the bullshit circle actually invites, but we know that while all of that is happening on the surface, and with with the kind of and I'm gonna tell a few VC jokes
Please,
here,
please, please, go ahead.
as you know, I enjoy
I
doing.
have a few myself. So.
Okay. Part of the problem is that the startup ecosystem, wherever you go in the world, has a very strong brag culture. And a big part of the brag culture is driven by investors because you need to be selling something that isn't yet, there. And so you need to basically like talk big about what's possible or what you've already achieved. But the problem with that is what psychologists would call pluralistic ignorance, which is this idea that if I go to all these spaces, if I go to sessions, and I go to all these startup events, and it seems like everyone is raising X million pesos, is expanding to these new markets, is hiring these many new people, and everyone is talking a big game. Well, many people come home and think, I guess I'm just the only one that doesn't know how to do this well. And so we find that a lot of founders who come to us really close the door before they start to speak, and they'll oftentimes talk about how this journey of confidence is really tricky.
I think imposter syndrome is one way you've heard.
Imposter
I've heard
syndrome
it
is
described.
is one way to think about it, and what we know from our data is that while founders expect that at the beginning of the journey you're less confident and over time you become more confident, we actually find in the data almost the opposite, which is you start very confident, and as you begin to realize just what it would take to be great at this job, then your confidence drops significantly. And your confidence will increase over time as you get better at what you do, but it never gets to the same level as when you began, when you knew nothing, right? And so this part of the workshop called the Bullshit Circle invites founders to reflect on what are the deep insecurities and self-doubt and the kind of imposter syndrome that they bring to the work. And then how do we mask up? Like, what are the ways in which I mask this up to my team? And we share this simple framework that we found in our study of these founders is there tends to be three ways that founders tend to cope with these moments of self-doubt. There's false optimism, false strength, and false detachment, right? So false optimism is where your inclination is to talk about, all the positivity and what could be possible, that we will succeed and all of this will be great, and almost in a toxic way where you kind of ignore the realities of what's happening. So when I go through this, you can think, okay, what's my mask, right? So false optimism. The second one, which is my mask, is false strength, which is feeling insecure, but then trying to cope with kind of being a bit, puffing up, being a bit, showing prestige, talking about achievements, saying that we've succeeded before, we'll succeed again. The way that shows up for me, and maybe I'll ask you, Paulo, what your mask is.
Sure.
The way it shows up for me is I lean a lot on all my knowledge about research and data and my academic background, and that helps me kind of be in those moments where I feel like, gosh, I don't know if I'll do well. Now, as you can tell, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's kind of good that I can talk about this data, but my team tells me often, like, Martin, are you just a walking encyclopedia? Or do you actually care about us, right? So in some ways, it becomes a toxic kind of coping mechanism. The last one is false detachment, which is your tendency to want to retreat into the background, maybe be incognito, maybe show that you're calm and independent. So between those three, like, we all kind of use one or two or three of these masks, right? So I don't know, Paolo, what's your mask?
Maybe just to before I jump in on my mask and give me some time to think. I think it's fascinating the way you walk through it in the book, right? You, on the one hand, say there are a series of traps that we all fall into as founders, and then what those traps lead to is that you as a founder necessarily have to put up this mask, right? And I think that term is something that I've come to use since we've met, even among the founders in our portfolio, because it resonates so well, right? And those of you who are in the room, shout out the Remotify founders here, for example. I'm sure some of these things you can relate to when you hear Martin talk about these masks that you have to put up, right? The fact that the false optimism, you have to fake it till you make it, right? And those in my Kaya team here know that sometimes I say that sometimes you just need to put up, right? You need to put up an optimistic look, and then maybe that's really what my mask is. My job is to shine a light on everything positive that's going on in the Philippine ecosystem, and it's not a hard job to do. There really is so much happening here. The fact that all of you are here today is perfect, is emblematic of that. But in reality, it's not all rosy all the time,
Yeah.
right? But in order to attract investors to this market, in order to attract funding to the startups that we back, you need to kind of fake it till you make it a little
Yeah.
bit, right? If I say
This
that
is right.
a little bit.
And this is why, and you're not getting off the hook. It'd be
Please,
nice to
no,
hear your.
go ahead.
But and this is why whenever we run the workshop, we have a few rules in the workshop. One of them is no bragging, no bullshit. So we say if you graduated from Stanford, if you spend time in a big tech company that sounds really shiny, there's no space for any of that in this workshop. And then secondly, there are no VCs allowed in the room.
Yeah.
So investors, please leave the room, and then we'll have a really good conversation with founders. And I find that that creates the conditions where people can really open up and talk about some of their challenges. Not this VC to be clear, because this one is enlightened in all the ways possible.
Exactly. Former founder turned VC, so it's a different perspective.
Yes.
I mean, I did want to mention one thing that I always think about in thinking about character and how we, act as founders, as investors in the ecosystem is something Manny Ayala always says, and shout out to Manny over here. The three M's that Manny always ensures that I remember at all times, and GM is also here from the Endeavor team. Matino, mabait, mabigay. Is that correct? Kulang. Magaling. And I
Kailangan
think
magaling.
the character is something that we're seeing, I think, in what you do, Martin, and in flying the flag here. The fact that you're, sharing your insights with us here, I think, is an example of you living those kind of traits and leadership there. So, my question is, so I think the book does a great job of ensuring that we are aware of the traps we might fall into and are cognizant that indeed there are masks that you put up, all of us, even us as investors, faking it till we make it to, try to get investment into our country and to fund and fuel the work that we do. How do we cope? What are the solutions that you bring forth in the book? And if you could share just like a framework for everyone to think about how to cope with these
Yeah.
realities.
So a big foundational idea that I think makes this workshop work really well is we help founders really put to question their theory of success, right? Which is, what do you think it will take to succeed in what you're trying to achieve? And I'll tell you, go a bit of a detour, right? So in the 1800s, surgery, the surgical field looked something like this. A surgeon would come into the hospital in their street clothes, riding on a horse, because it's the 1800s. They enter the surgical theater, which, by the way, is like open to everyone. Wearing their street clothes, they go about, hacking open people. They have their needles, their sutures in their lapels. When they're ready to sew them up, they'll sew it up. If a bandage falls to the floor, they'll pick it up and tie it. Now, as you can expect, the success rate of these surgeries were incredibly low. And their theory of success was this idea that it was in the air. Like there was something in the air that caused kind of infection, which then leads to the deaths of these people. So they were thinking of all these sophisticated ways to create more sophisticated surgical methods, only to see that the success rate stayed the same. It took someone who was not in the medical field, a biologist by the name of Pasteur, to then discover the germ theory, which is that infection comes from these microbiomes, which then he goes on to do creates the pasteurization process, which allows for stable milk, etc. So whenever I engage with founders, I ask them, so what is your germ theory? Like, what is that theory of success that you are maybe mistaken by, that you need to revise or rethink? And the workshop really gives you a chance to uncover all of that and really spend the time to think through whether your theory of success is correct or not. And when you ask the question, what does it take to get motivated, smart people to grow as individuals? What we've learned in doing this at Google over the years and with founders, really the core mechanism of change is really good feedback. You don't need to solve it for people. You just need to hold up a mirror to them, and smart, motivated people will basically figure out how to solve it. Now, that's not to say that the book doesn't have any solutions. We talk about really important solutions. One thing that I will, there was a lot of uproar about this idea of founding with friends and family, but one of the things that we like to share with founding teams that have this configuration. Um, One of my favorite stories in the book is actually a story from Xerox Spark. Xerox Spark is a research and R&D arm of Xerox, the company, the photocopier, but they were actually well ahead of their time from Xerox Spark. So Xerox Spark stands for Palo Alto Research Center. So they were one of the early research centers based in the Bay Area, in Silicon Valley. And from this place, you get the personal computer from which Steve Jobs and Bill Gates supposedly steal the IP. You get the first mouse. You get the technologies that eventually creates Pixar, 3Com, Adobe. So prolific place of innovation. Now, there's this person in the history books named Bob Taylor. Bob Taylor is a lab manager who himself is not a technical person. So he was there just to manage the team. And he said that when I think of my role is to graduate class 1 disagreements to class 2 disagreements. What did he mean by that? Class 1 disagreements are arguments where you have what you might call a straw man argument, where I hear your point of view, Paulo, and I'll reflect it back in the weakest way possible, making it easy for me to refute, right? Mm-hmm. And then he says, instead, you want to aspire for class 2 disagreements, which is if Paulo shares a point of view that I disagree with, before I disagree with it, I will represent back to Paulo his idea in a way that is satisfying to you. That represents the best qualities of that argument. You might call it a strong man argument as opposed to a straw man argument. And then and only then do I go ahead and refute. Now, Bob Taylor in this story says that my job is not to resolve conflict. My job is simply to spot class 1 disagreements and graduate them to class 2 disagreements. And so in your teams, this is something you can already do right away, right? As you're listening to conversation, as you're listening to arguments, think of how you can make sure that you elevate that to class 2 disagreements.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful advice. And what I love about the insights of your book, Martin, is it's not only relevant for startups.
Yeah.
All of us are business people. We all work in an organization of some size with a particular objective. All of us living in the Philippines now and working in Filipino culture, which again, I think I want to double click on,
Yeah.
I think insights around being Filipino, because I think your book is so crucial precisely because of how indirect a culture we have, right?
Yeah.
And I've seen too many startups fail, exactly as you said, because they left what had to be said unsaid.
Yeah.
And I think that's a particularly, we have the particular risk of that happening in the Philippines with our kind of painfully indirect culture that way. But just in terms of how that then is applicable to other organizations and stakeholder groups, right? We have not only great founders in the group, in the room, we have great investors in the room. I'll shout out Andre Yap of Ignite House here, Kendrico back there who runs Hyperparameter AI Fund based in the US. These are investors who then are on the other side of the equation, right? So it's assessing whether a founder has the right character traits to deliver a successful outcome.
Yeah.
It's something I've had to figure out and come to my own conclusion on in the last 4+ years since we've been doing this work that we have at Kaya. And to share with you my conclusion, when people ask me what does it take, what is the key success factor for a founder to be successful, it's really nothing to do with their pedigree, right, with their previous experience. And of course, all of that matters in the domain expertise. It's really more a personality and character trait around the ability to take feedback and adapt and be magaling, matino, all of the stuff Manny says, smart enough and agile enough to take that feedback to adapt, right?
Yeah.
Because I think in that, there's multiple facets. There's the humility to accept when you're not the smartest person in the room, right? And that's a little bit speaking to this kind of false optimism, false strength mask that we often wear. It takes the capability to know what the right pivot is to make and how you should involve it that way. And I think that so that's why when I was reading your book, it was really capturing in a much better way than I was trying to grapple with what I look for in these adaptable founders who are able to take input
Yeah.
from well-meaning, not only investors, but people on the journey, stakeholders with them, and turn around and make their business more successful.
Yeah.
So if I were to turn the insight on its head, right? So not so much for founders, but for investors. What are the leading traits that you see in the successful founders among the peer group?
Yeah. So it's a great one, and I'll echo one thing you said, and I'll add one more thing, which is we in the chapter we write on the trap of confidence. We actually talk about this kind of leader that we call the confident humility, or the leader with confident humility. So there's really interesting research that's been done in the US and that's been replicated in places like China, where they look at, how well do overconfident leaders do compared to humble leaders. And we know that overconfident leaders do worse than humble leaders. So humble leaders tend to do a little bit better. People are, they're able to bring in, people's energy and, and discretionary effort into the work. But what does even better than the humble leaders is this confident humility in leaders. And what that looks like is that they are confident in the mission. They're confident in the product that we can deliver on some important, meaningful, goals for our users. But they're humble enough to know that, I can't do this on my own. I need to bring in really brilliant people. And when I bring in brilliant people, and there's another study out of MIT that studied this, where it's not simply enough to bring an adult into the room or to have an adult in the management team. If you have a founder who does not release decision-making power to these adults in the room, you basically cancel out any upside you can get from, from hiring these professionals into your management team. So there's a certain amount of confident humility you need to really run a tight ship. The other thing I would add, and when we put under a microscope these really successful founders and compare them to the least successful, we found this trait which we started to call treating people like volunteers, which is not simply to have a really compelling pitch deck and you can kind of talk about the amazing vision that you have, but it's understanding that good people have options, and because you likely cannot pay better than many of your other competitors, the way that you're going to really entice them to come and work hard for your startup is if you understand what they personally want to get out of their career, and you figure out, like, how do I position their work in this startup as the way that meets their goals and not how it meets my goals. A bit of a sidebar here. Where I first learned leadership, and Chase is here, who represents Encanto, but also a good friend from my early days. I think really the best place to learn leadership is in a volunteer-based organization. For me, it was in my student clubs, and then it was in a faith-based organization. And in these places, you really do not have a paycheck to pay people. And so people are there simply on the how compelling your vision is and how well you're able to energize the group. Now, if you find someone, if you have a founder who has that kind of quality, that magnetic quality that's able to bring together really brilliant people to work on this, like, do not discount that. Like, that is a very precious, and look, part of that is confident humility is a very attractive trait. We know that humble people are a lot more attractive than overconfident people from the data. And so you want to be looking for that. You can also, in the book, we talk about those 6 other strategies that founders, but this was by far what really set apart the most effective founders from the least. It's this quality of treating people like volunteers.
Yeah, amazing insights, Mart. Honestly, as I was reading the book, I really reflected on my own career, and I found so much of your empirical findings, right? And that's what I love about it. This is not just your opinion, right?
Yeah.
And this is actually empirical basis. The how many hundreds of thousands of startups that as part of the Google network, and arriving at these conclusions that we all have a sense of as business people, right? We have the sense of being vulnerable, and it's a great way to bring people along with you on the journey. But to define it in such a way that allows all of us to be self-reflective about our own leadership styles and how we can bring others along with us on the journey accordingly. I think the book really does a great job
Thank
capturing
you.
those insights. So really, hats off to you there. And shout out to my overworked and underpaid Kaya team for acting like volunteers
So,
and
so we want to make
Leo
it.
over there, then Danielle and Gabby over here. Yeah.
So we want to make it clear that when we say treat people like volunteers, we don't mean pay them like volunteers. Okay.
Just kidding, guys. Yeah. No, but indeed, I think this idea of confident humility, it very much resonates, and this idea of being then adaptable, humble enough to accept feedback, take that feedback and pivot your business or improve your business for the better. I think that's really where I see, from my own experience, a lot of truth to that. I want to speak about the cultural aspect, Martin, right?
Yeah.
I mean, to this point, we could have had the same chat if we were in Stanford as we did a couple of months back or in other places in the world. You're home, you're among friends, you're among people you grew up with, who you worked with previously. You have a particular insight on the Filipino culture
Yeah.
and the fact that you wrote this book without that necessarily in mind, but you also are Filipino and grew up here and have all of that context and insight. I think this would be a perfect forum to share. What are your thoughts to us as Filipinos or adopted Filipinos, as we lovingly say, who are in the Philippines, building for the country, trying to do our part to lift the country up? You give us practical advice, whatever you want.
Yeah.
What is your message to us Filipinos here trying to help the country?
Maybe I'll say two things. So one is probably by far the number one thing that a lot of non-Filipino founders who are building companies here come to me complaining about is this thing that you started to talk about around being such an indirect communication culture.
Yep.
So that's not entirely a bad thing, because I think what I find is, especially when I find myself in Silicon Valley, like I find that I'm able to read the unspoken dynamics a lot more effectively than people who are used to very direct communication styles. So there are gifts there, right? But we know actually that indirectness actually creates many sources of inefficiencies in a company. I was previously just working with so a lot of larger companies come to me saying, look, you've seen Google, you've seen all these startups, like help us kind of fix our culture because we want to be more like these innovative places. And we find that a lot of companies really, when you're in a position of power, you kind of enjoy the perks of hierarchy. It feels good. Like, you get treated a little bit with more respect and people defer to your point of view. It actually inherently feels good. And as a result, what happens is you silence a lot of the bad news that comes to you very quickly. You hear this a lot in corporate life. You'll hear statements like, don't come to me with problems, come to me with solutions. That's actually a very dangerous management practice. You want people to come with problems, and if they have solutions, come with that too, but you should be able to open your door and have them come with. So one of the things that I tell founders is this is where structure becomes like a kind of structured dialogue becomes really a good practice. So I've asked founders a very basic 2-minute hack, which is at the beginning of a meeting, when you want to come to a decision and you want to hear the diversity of opinions of your group, instead of the boss speaking first, which is the practice when you have a lot of hierarchy in an organization, have all your people take out a Post-it or take out their phones and write their point of view on this topic. What you're doing by doing that first is you capture the full range of opinions in the group without it getting anchored by the most powerful person's point of view, right? So the moment someone powerful speaks up, suddenly everyone ever so slightly gravitates toward that point of view. So have them write it down first, and then have each one read out and talk about their point of view and give them uninterrupted time. What you'll find, and I've done this with many founders now, what you'll find is that you will hear all the bad news that you just never heard previously, and you can then very quickly solve for it. And for me, like, hierarchy is not bad. I think we spent a bit, a portion of a chapter talking about the benefits of hierarchy. But in a place like the Philippines, where that's the default, there's a lot of upside if you start to break down that hierarchy. There's a story we tell in the book about this, where a Silicon Valley founder comes to Singapore and tries to build a company. And they start to hire from places like Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam. So places where this deference to hierarchy was a really big deal. And then he would be in these product meetings and he would notice that the junior engineer would kind of look at the corner of their eye as if to defer to their manager before they speak up. And he knew that that was poison to the culture. So what he did was he brought together his leadership team and said, we're gonna create a prank culture, a prank culture. You're going to come up with pranks with the junior engineers and you're gonna prank me, the big boss, to humanize me. And so what happens for a few months after that is he comes to the to the parking lot and his entire car is saran wrapped in plastic. They come up with a false newspaper that kind of pretends that the product was leaked to the media and he's about to, he's about to call his investors to say sorry. So like, and some of those really help create that, bring down that hierarchy. So that's the first thing. I think dealing with this indirect communication culture is an important thing to deal with. The second one is, I think we spoke about this in Stanford. I think when you think of the ecosystem as a whole and what does it take to really make entrepreneurship thrive in the Philippines, there's an interesting study from one of my collaborators that I lecture with. Her name is Valentina Asanova in Wharton. And she studied this idea called cultural tightness and cultural looseness. And the idea behind this is cultural tightness are cultures, are national cultures where when someone deviates from the norm, when someone leaves, or does something that's out of the norm, a culturally tight society will punish that person or will look at that as something to be frowned upon. A culturally loose society is a society that looks at that person and celebrates them for doing the less obvious thing or taking the less common path. Well, she does this study across all the countries in the world and looks at which countries are culturally tight, culturally loose. You think of Silicon Valley, very much a culturally loose environment. You think of the Philippines, to some extent, a very culturally tight environment. And she actually said you can predict the amount of entrepreneurial activity in a country based on how culturally tight or loose they are. The more culturally loose countries will have this flourishing of entrepreneurship. And so to some extent, I think if we were to think at an ecosystem level, Paulo, I think there's work that could be done around, how do we celebrate the person that kind of takes the riskier path? And how do we celebrate people who maybe don't do the obvious thing, who have convictions about what the future holds and get celebrated for that? So I think that's some of the things that I think we could be doing as an ecosystem here.
I think it's been very helpful. Keenan wrote about this in his article, Independent Investor. I think one of the insights Keenan and I really took away from that Stanford chat we had was this cultural looseness and tightness concept, right? And in the Philippines, we're very sigurista, right? Like we want the certain path. My parents never told me to be an entrepreneur. They said go find a high-paying job and have a stable job, the job security that comes with a secure, high-paying job, right? I think in contrast to kind of the Silicon Valley culture of really celebrating the renegades, those who really put themselves out there and take risk, right? So I think a big part of since that chat we had that we try to also then inform how we try to support the local ecosystem is exactly that, right? You need to be celebrating, failures are not failures, right? Failures are learning moments of which some of the best startups were born coming out of the ashes of, something that you say failed or didn't work out. That is often the beginning of an amazing journey, not the end, right? And I think all too often we Filipinos are too sigurista in that sense, right? And then really insisting that be a more certain path. And it's really what excites us about what's happening in our local ecosystem is you really feel that change, right? You really feel that it's now becoming mainstream a little bit to be an entrepreneur, become a founder.
Yeah.
Don't just work for a corporate. That's actually the expected path is no longer one that many of the particularly young people want to go through.
One thing I'd love to see more of in the Philippines are more second, third time founders. I think a lot of founders do their first thing. If they fail, they either go corporate or they become an investor. But at some point, Paul, you should get back into it because you learn so much. A lot of the book will be obvious lessons for a second-time founder because they would have lived through all of this. It doesn't seem to be the trend here that people jump. Maybe you know more now, but I was checking with some other folks in the VC circles, and it seems like the more likely path is to kind of retreat back into the safe haven of a corporate job.
Right, right. I mean, I consider what we do at Kai the most entrepreneurial thing I've ever done. So I like to think this is my
There
new
you go.
startup in helping to back founders. But certainly, I think that's exactly true, and making it part of our culture to have this culture of entrepreneurship, and that to celebrate the fact that you become a founder, right? I
Yeah.
think that's something that, very practically speaking, from Martin's research, we can think about relative to our context. So I know we will have questions. So I do encourage all of you. We wanted to just unpack, for those of you who might not have gotten a chance to read the book yet, unpack some of the insights and the, kind of what the point of the book.